The sudden death of a former Detroit anchor and media executive brought loved ones and colleagues together today to honor her contributions to the city. CW50's Chris Walker shows us how she's being remembered.
Karen Hudson Samuel's career in broadcast journalism spanned over 4 decades in Detroit. After making her name at WGPR-TV as an anchor, producer, and news director, the historian and journalist used her vision to create one of the biggest accomplishments of her lifetime.
We were talking about all the great people who had went through WGPR, TV 62, and that we just thought that, hey, this story of this great institution should not die.
To preserve the history of the country's first black-owned and operated television station, WGPR, Samuels worked tirelessly to bring the William V. Banks Broadcast Museum to life.
When this museum got in the National Register, she was very, very proud.
The 68-year-old sudden death leaves the industry reciting her legacy and questioning why she had to go so soon.
So in the spirit of Karen, I want you to always know that the times may change, but these 2 words that Karen understood had great power, and that is thank you.
And she was just a beautiful person. I mean, it's such a huge loss for this community.
I spoke with Karen the afternoon that she passed, and all we had was a long list of things she wanted to do, and that list was just getting longer.
The Detroit media icon was found dead at her home last Tuesday by her husband just 1 day after taking the COVID-19 vaccine.
Growing concerns tonight from some in North Carolina that they will be forced to get vaccinated. Good evening, everyone. I'm Rod Carter.
I'm Angela Taylor. Some of the people concerned packed the lawn of the legislative building today, demanding support of a bill that offers protection for people who don't want to get the vaccine.
CBS 17's Jamise Price heard their concerns today and shares why they are backing this bill. Jamise.
Rod, this demonstration lasted all day. This lawn just outside the legislative building, it was packed with a few hundred folks who, for the most part, want to make sure they are not required by the government, a business, or their job to get a vaccine or show proof they received it. The message, loud and clear. Their body, their choice. A message they're calling medical freedom. This group doesn't want the COVID-19 vaccine and doesn't want to be required to get it. At this time, it's not a requirement by the state. In HB 558, a proposed bill would prohibit it from ever happening.
This is more about protecting our bodies, protecting our freedom.
Jenny Kay was one of a few hundred people who rallied for support of HB 558 on the lawn of the General Assembly. The bill prohibits the governor from requiring or mandating that everyone receives a vaccine through an executive order. It would also give civil and criminal immunity to anybody who refuses to receive a COVID-19 vaccination.
Whether they are doing it or not, this is so that it's not possible at all. Protecting our freedom, that's just it.
The bill also bans businesses from requiring a person to disclose whether or not they received a COVID-19 COVID-19 vaccine to enter their facility.
So it's going to put people that just want to live their lives be left alone in a situation where they have to take an injection of foreign material into their body in order to just live their lives.
Now, this bill, if it becomes law, will add some extra protection in the workplace. It would prohibit an employer from hiring or firing someone based on their vaccination history. Now, this bill is all about choice, and is ironic because it's going to limit the choices that a business would have. Live in Raleigh, Jamise Price, CBS 17 News.
Record numbers of Americans are getting vaccinated against the coronavirus.
The U.S., the most vaccinated large nation in the world.
Dozens of countries are now working to vaccinate their populations in an effort to end the global pandemic.
President Biden says that by the end of his first 100 days, the United States is aiming to have administered 200 million doses. And by May 2021, every American adult who wants one will be eligible to get in line for a shot. That said, 30% of U.S. adults still don't want to get the COVID vaccine, but they may not have much of a choice.
The federal government can require vaccination and things like that for coming in and out of the country. Both the state and city can have vaccine laws based on their legislative authority.
Requiring a vaccine is a health and safety work rule, and employers can do that.
Bonnie Jacobson knows this all too well. The Brooklyn resident was recently let go from her job after refusing to get inoculated.
I was sitting at home and I all of a sudden just opened an email. I'm sitting on my couch and it said, basically, while we respect your decision at this time, your employment has been terminated.
So can you actually be forced to take the COVID vaccine against your will in the United States? To be clear, the White House's chief medical advisor has already said that he doesn't think the federal government will ever make the COVID vaccine mandatory. However, powers at the city and state level, not to mention the legal rights granted to employers under U.S. labor law, may make it pretty difficult for some Americans to evade inoculation against the coronavirus. This isn't as unprecedented as you might think. There are a lot of required inoculations which are easy to take for granted. Just take the chicken pox. All 50 states and the District of Columbia have laws requiring children entering childcare or public schools to have some sort of provable protection against the disease, whether that's a vaccine or evidence of immunity. In fact, schools, from preschool through university, typically require a battery of inoculations before you can step foot on campus.
When I was health commissioner in Washington, D.C., we had passed laws that required anyone who went to a school to be vaccinated against certain preventable diseases.
There are religious, medical, and philosophical exemptions that vary state by state, but for around 170 years, America's schools have done a pretty thorough job controlling vaccine-preventable disease in the U.S. The very first school vaccination mandate was in Massachusetts back in the 1850s. It was to protect against smallpox transmission. By the start of the 20th century, almost half of all states required students to be vaccinated before matriculating. In the early 1970s, schools with a measles vaccine mandate had incidence rates that were up to 51% lower than states without the laws. And from there, school vaccine mandates expanded over the next few decades. But while schools had been requiring vaccines since the mid-19th century, states didn't explicitly have that same power to roll out universal inoculation rules for all residents for another 50 years. In 1905, the Supreme Court case of Jacobson versus Massachusetts set the legal precedent which now allows states to require vaccines.
The Supreme Court said, yes, you can limit individual rights to protect the public health, and one way you can do it in that case is require vaccination.
We've seen states exercise this authority to varying degrees in the years since. Take, for example, the 2019 measles outbreak in New York.
New York imposed a mandate. It imposed an MMR mandate, but it limited it to the neighborhoods where the measles cases were high, and it was accompanied by a $1,000 fine for those who did not have MMR.
Legal experts say that narrowing the vaccine mandate to particular zip codes made it easier to justify in court rather than a statewide mandate. But critics warn that these types of targeted requirements may lead to discriminatory practices.
In general, these things are done at the state level, but big cities, for example, also have vaccine laws. When I was the city health commissioner in Washington, D.C., although that certainly functions as a state, we also had vaccine laws in Washington, D.C.
So far, no cities or states have made the COVID vaccine mandatory, though some places have started the conversation. In November 2020, the New York State Bar Association recommended making the shot mandatory for all residents except those with a medical exemption. And then, of course, there's the biggest rulemaker of them all, the federal government, which in this case actually has pretty limited powers expressly spelled out in the Constitution.
There isn't in the Constitution the power to protect the public health.
Well, the federal government doesn't mandate vaccines. What they do is they make recommendations.
There are, however, softer powers at the federal level that have been used before to incentivize mass inoculation.
The federal government has acted in the public health in the past using other parts, such as its commerce part. So it could, for example, mandate vaccines before you travel in the interstate channels or before you engage in interstate commerce. If you're a truck driver that drives across state, maybe the federal government can mandate that you'll be vaccinated.
The power of the purse is another key tool in Washington's arsenal.
It can pass a law saying states will give you $3 million if you mandate the vaccine, but that's up to a limit. It can't do it to the degree that's coercive.
The federal government could also, theoretically, impose it as a condition of getting a passport. So states and cities can require vaccines, and the federal government has a lot of influence as well. But the big question is whether the government will actually go through with rolling out a universal mandate.
The first challenge is we won't have enough vaccine doses for people who want them. You can't require vaccines that's not available, that people can't get.
Another major factor to consider, none of the 3 COVID vaccines in circulation here in the US are fully licensed by the FDA. Instead, they are all cleared under something known as an emergency use authorization, or an EUA. Until they are officially approved, mandates seem to be off the table. And then there's the even bigger question of enforcement.
Mandates to some degree depend on pretty widespread compliance. You can't enforce a mandate if 40% of your population is fighting back. If the problem is widespread mistrust, mandate won't fix it. You need communication, you need education, you need to earn the people's trust by transparently showing them that the vaccine is safe and effective, by explaining to them the process of approving it, and so forth.
And keep in mind, if any city or state did implement a mandate, the kinds of repercussions we're talking about are relatively tame. No one is floating the idea of jail time or coming to your house and holding you down while they administer a shot. Refusal would probably just mean a fine or maybe some sort of other tax or penalty. Experts say it may also mean you are barred from entry to concerts or can't book a seat on certain airlines. In Israel, for example, they use the green passport to allow access to businesses like hotels and restaurants to those who have been vaccinated against the virus or have already had COVID-19. Implementation, though, might be tough here in the US. So how will this actually play out? Experts tell me the most likely scenario is a repeat of what we've seen in the past. Once the COVID vaccines are fully approved by the FDA, a vaccine may eventually be a requirement for school-aged children in both public and private institutions, starting at daycare and extending to universities. Let's say the city where you live decides against requiring the COVID vaccine. Does that mean you're free from mandatory COVID inoculation? Not necessarily. Your employer may not be willing to take no for an answer. Jacobson was a waitress in Brooklyn and served patrons all through the pandemic. She told NBC New York that while she isn't an anti-vaxxer, she did have concerns about getting the shot because she's trying to get pregnant.
My general manager has told me multiple times it wasn't going to be mandatory.
When her former employer, Red Hook Tavern, asked if she planned to get the vaccine now that it's available for restaurant workers, she shared those worries.
Over the last couple months, I had just heard a few things about how it can affect fertility and pregnancy, and I just wanted to have a better understanding of that and do a little more research. I said that once I had more information, I would definitely be willing to change my mind on getting the vaccine. I expressed that, I understand why they're important. I think that the vaccine's a good thing. I'm not against them.
Within a few days, she received an email from her employer saying that they respected her decision, but they would be terminating her employment because of their new policy to maintain a safe working environment.
I've made it clear to my lawyer that I want to go in whatever direction I think will help the most amount of people have this same situation not happen to them.
CNBC reached out to Red Hook Tavern for comment, and we didn't hear back as of the date of publication. Jacobson's firing appears to be totally legal here in the U.S. I spoke with lawyers across the country, and they all say that their clients are reaching out to them in record numbers to ask what they should do about the vaccine.
Clients of mine that are most interested in making a mandatory vaccine a condition of employment are brick and mortar operations that have a lot of foot traffic from their customers. They view it as a selling point. Look, you can come into our business location and it's safe because all employees have been vaccinated. That's particularly important for restaurants, bars, gyms, and salons. And so my clients in that segment of service industry are particularly looking hard at making it mandatory as a sales point to their customers.
While this is in part a PR tactic, it's also totally within an employer's rights to roll out this kind of requirement. Legal experts say private businesses have pretty extensive rights. Requiring a vaccine is a health and safety work rule. Employers, like some hospitals, already require employees to get the annual influenza vaccine. So there's precedent that under the law, an employer can force an employee to get vaccinated, and if they don't, fire them. There are a few ways that employees could apply to be exempt from a blanket requirement. If a workforce is unionized, the collective bargaining agreement may require negotiating with the union before mandating a vaccine. Anti-discrimination laws also provide some protections. Now, other employers think that incentives are the better route to widespread inoculation in the workplace. That could mean that if you get the vaccine, you don't have to wear the same level of PPE in the office or have your temperature taken every day. There's also talk of offering financial perks.
Many of my clients who are struggling with this issue have said, well, while we think it's a good idea to make it mandatory, we are going to make it voluntary, but we're going to try to offer economic incentives, bonuses, as well as paying for the vaccination and offering optionally, if the family wants to have the vaccination, to pay for that too.
Also, because an EUA is not a license, there is a legal question as to whether you can mandate an emergency authorization.
Well, they're not a fully licensed product. So the ability to require your employees to be vaccinated will be highly controversial. In fact, I would argue that an employer cannot require you to be vaccinated with anything other than a fully licensed product.
Mandatory vaccination protocols, therefore, may have to wait until the FDA completes the entire approval process for the COVID vaccines. Ultimately, a big part of whether the U.S. achieves herd immunity against the coronavirus comes down to whether the population buys into the science. Pfizer and Moderna built their COVID vaccines with a new kind of technology that's never before been licensed in the U.S. mRNA vaccines are pretty revolutionary in the world of medicine, but they also signify a natural progression of science. So far, it does seem that a concerted effort to educate the general public about COVID vaccine safety and efficacy is working. A 2021 Pew Research survey published in March showed that 69% of U.S. adults have either already gotten the vaccine or they intend to. Dr. Fauci says that if 75 to 80% of Americans are vaccinated, then by the end of the summer of 2021, we may be able to achieve herd immunity. If this polling bears out over the coming months, we'd certainly be trending in that direction, and mandates may not even be necessary.
Lawyer Helen Rella, who advises corporations and governments doing business in the U.S. and overseas, for more on who can legally require people to get the vaccine. Good morning to you, Helen. Thanks so much for being with us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
And you know, this is interesting. So many people are already talking about this, and the big question everyone has, can employers require their employees to have the vaccine before coming back to work?
And the answer to that question is generally speaking going to be yes. Because employers set the terms and conditions of employment, employers are going to be able to require that their employees get the vaccination. Now, that said, there will be exceptions to that. An employee may ask for an accommodation under either the Americans with Disabilities Act, asserting that they have some medical condition that prevents them from being vaccinated, or they might claim an exemption under Title VII, claiming that they have a sincerely held religious belief that would prevent them from being vaccinated. But other than those two instances, the answer we anticipate will be yes.
Well, and then that kind of, from that, could governments and public schools require you to also get the vaccine?
The consensus now seems to be that the government is not going to go down that route, although there is some precedent for the notion that public safety outweighs individual liberties. But we haven't yet taken that road. The more likely course is that it's going to be a very strong recommendation.
I think for a lot of people, hearing that you're going to have to get the vaccine to go to work is really concerning. There are already a huge allotment of people who are kind of against vaccines. Do you expect that we'll start to see lawsuits pushing back on this?
Well, you never know. You never know. We do know that, in fact, that in certain sectors, for example, in the healthcare industry, flu vaccinations have already been mandated, and employees in those fields have been required and successfully required to take the vaccination in order to continue to work. If there will be lawsuits, it remains to be seen.
What about in places where people are paying to go, not being paid to be there? Places like airplanes and sports arenas. Can the vaccine be required for admittance into those kinds of places?
I think that given the severity of the pandemic, getting the vaccine is going to become almost commonplace. There is an anticipation that foreign governments may require certification of vaccination, perhaps appended to a passport, in order to enter the country. So the more that this continues, it's going to be difficult to navigate in society without having the vaccine. So it's going to become a matter of course. But yes, there is a likelihood that you may be required in certain instances to take the vaccination or to show proof of the vaccination.
That seems to flow in line with what we've seen for having to get shots to go visit certain countries already at this point. My other question, could there be some exemptions? Like, would those just be for medical reasons, or could there also be exemptions for moral or religious reasons that people could lean on in this moment if they feel anxiety about getting a vaccine?
Yes, well, as I said earlier, in the workplace, the two exemptions that are applicable are either a medical exemption under the Americans with Disabilities Act or a religious exemption under Title VII.
All right, Helen Rella for us. Thank you. Some really interesting information, and I'm sure we're going to see this play out more in the coming days. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
The Nuremberg Code is the most important document in the history of the ethics of medical research. The code was formulated 70 years ago, in August 1947, in Nuremberg, Germany, by American judges sitting in judgment of Nazi doctors accused of conducting murderous and torturous human experiments in the concentration camps, the so-called doctor's trial. It served as a blueprint for today's principles that ensure the rights of subjects in medical research. The 10 principles of the code are: first, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice, without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. This latter element requires that before the acceptance of an affirmative decision by the experimental subject, there should be made known to him the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, the method and means by which it is to be conducted, all inconveniences and hazards reasonably to be expected, and the effects upon his health or person which may possibly come from his participation in the experiment. The duty and responsibility for ascertaining the quality of the consent rests upon each individual who initiates, directs, or engages in the experiment. It is a personal duty and responsibility which may not be delegated to another with impunity. Second, the experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society, unprocurable by other methods or means of study, and not random and unnecessary in nature. Third, the experiment should be so designed and based on the results of animal experimentation and a knowledge of the natural history of the disease or other problem under study, that the anticipated results will justify the performance of the experiment. Fourth, the experiment should be conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. Fifth, no experiment should be conducted where there is an a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. Sixth, the degree of risk to be taken should never exceed that determined by the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by the experiment. Seventh, proper preparation should be made and adequate facilities provided to protect the experimental subject against even remote possibilities of injury, disability, or death. Eighth, the experiment should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons. The highest degree of skill and care should be required through all stages of the experiment of those who conduct or engage in the experiment. Ninth, during the course of the experiment, the human subject should be at liberty to bring the experiment to an end, if he has reached the physical or mental state where continuation of the experiment seems to him to be impossible. And finally, 10th, during the course of the experiment, the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage, if he has probable cause to believe, in the exercise of the good faith, superior skill, and careful judgment required of him, that a continuation of the experiment is likely to result in injury, disability, or death to the experimental subject.